Hello everyone, Dr. Eames here. What I'd like to talk about this time is the behavioral management perspective. Now, this grew out of ideas that were certainly percolating at the time that the classical management perspective was in full bloom and widely accepted as the one best way to do management. But there were always those theorists who were concerned about the human element in the equation in the workplace that scientific management and administrative management really did seem to neglect. So the emphasis for the behavioral management perspective was on individual attitudes and understanding the individual behavior of workers. And of course, psychology was a budding profession at the same time as management was, and there were many new ideas and books out all the time, and it was an exciting time, really, when we were learning more about the human condition. So the emphasis was not only on those individual attitudes and behaviors, but also on the group processes that seemed to be at work in the workplace. So the overall emphasis on behavior in the workplace. There are three theorists to talk about here: Hugo Munsterberg, Parker Follet, and Elton Mayo. So I'll start with Hugo Munsterberg. He wrote an influential book, Psychology and Industrial Efficiency. So he was basically an industrialist. He was born about the time of the Civil War and lived through about World War I, the 1916, 17, something like that. He contributed thinking that really applied to understanding and putting into effect knowledge of why people do things, what motivates them, and what their behavior's about. So he felt it was important for management to recognize that human element in the workplace. So he became noted for his work in industrial psychology in particular. He felt that why not use the field of psychology and all the knowledge there when we select and recruit workers, for example. So he was very much about applying this new knowledge to doing a better job of management. And certainly these ideas were going to replace scientific management and administrative management at some point, simply from the point of view of how we view people and their worth and why they work and so forth. The second theorist to talk about here is Parker Follet. She was an American. She was born about the time of the Civil War and lived through the 1930s, and she really was an early pioneer of the human element in the workplace. Her work has largely been forgotten today, unfortunately, but she was a far-thinking woman. She was unusual for her time, simply because she was an educated female, but she was a patrician, lived somewhere in New England, I'm not sure exactly where, but she was wealthy, so she was able to get an education, which certainly was not the norm for most females at that time. Remember, women didn't get the vote until, I believe, the 1920s, something like that. But certainly we were well into the 20th century before they got that right. And so certainly a pioneer in many ways. She was influential with the books that she wrote on the human element in the workplace. She lectured widely at colleges and universities. She lectured before Congress and so forth, and to organizations as well. She took the viewpoint that organizations could be viewed from a couple of different viewpoints, both the individual perspective and also the group behavior perspective, and that there was an interaction there and that things were going on, dynamics, that if we could understand them, we could be more successful in managing people. So for her, a key to effective management was coordination, making sure everything worked smoothly and that we coordinated with each other, that we actually talk to each other. So it was a departure from the classical management perspective, where managers were meant to be aloof because they had the knowledge and workers weren't really supposed to think. From her point of view, managers should coordinate with their workers. They should harmonize the group effort using knowledge of how group processes work. And this instead of forcing people to do things, coercing them, and of course that ever-present close supervision that was widely believed to be the only way to get people to work, and that was the only thing that motivated them other than money. She viewed that management is certainly a dynamic process, and that if we're going to make good decisions, the best decisions are made by people who are closest to the situation. So really what that implies is that she was thinking about delegating and letting people make low-level decisions who really understand the work of how to do something better than their manager did, and so forth. The final theorist I'd like to talk about here is Elton Mayo and his associates, really, who did a bunch of research studies at Western Electric between 1927 and 1935. So that's a lengthy time for a bunch of experiments to be done. The significance of Western Electric can't be underestimated. This is one of the premier technology companies of its time at the turn of the 20th century. Western Electric was the precursor to Ma Bell, AT&T. They hold all the major patents on telephones and sound transmission and indeed many other basic things we take for granted today that many modern inventions are based on. So the Hawthorne Studies is what Elton Mayo is most closely associated with. The whole idea of his experiments and those of his associates were to study working conditions, but in particular the notion that we needed close supervision, because it was still widely assumed that people really did need that close supervision, or they would soldier and just be lazy and not work. So he would set standards for the work group and change them often over these many experiments. He would change the lighting, how quickly they received the materials they needed to do the work and how quickly they didn't, how many hours they had to work, whether or not they got much instruction. And it was just an endless variety of variations of the workday, all accompanied by close supervision, which was kind of a foregone conclusion from their point of view as what they wanted to prove. But that's not what they found out at all. They really discovered over the length of these experiments, and what we really realize today from this great body of work, is that human behavior was certainly a lot more important in the workplace than ever previously realized or even accepted and admitted. That incentive plans and wages and all the structure of the bureaucracy and things like that were much less important to people than actually being accepted socially. Social acceptance was everything, and they found out that the norms in the workplace weren't set by close supervision or the managers taking charge, but they were set informally by peer pressure and so forth, that work groups really do have an incredible influence in the workplace. Just think about what you know from jobs you've had yourself. If you're in a work group and you know that if you go to a place to work, you have to fit in somewhere. There are always many cliques in every organization, every workplace, and you have to fit into at least the key ones where you do your everyday work and your job and where you show up and interact with people. If you don't fit in, you don't have a very good time at work, you don't last long, and you have a pretty miserable job experience. And I think this is fairly evident. So the group enforces the norms. For instance, if you were in a work group and you were lagging behind, say, in the minds of your peers who did the same work and are in the same work group, they might think or even say to you in some way, hey, why don't you speed it up? You're making us look bad. You're lagging. You're not really keeping up your end of the part of the work group here. But there's another side to it too. The overachiever, the person who just works really hard because they believe in it and they don't care what anybody else is doing. And the group might be thinking or even tell that person, hey, why don't you cool it a little bit? You're making us all look bad. That's not how we do it around here. And so I think this is very much true, that this is how the group and informal pressures and dynamics of all type really do set the tone in the workplace, and that this is part of the behavioral managerial experience, that we need to pay attention to these processes, understand behavior and group processes in order to really do the best job. And this goes way beyond what we learn in the classical management perspective. Okay, that's all I have to talk about this time.